thank you all for being here tonight. So I just wanted to say thank you before we get started. And to just set the stage, in 1977, after you were denied access from doing your job, covering the World Series as a 26-year-old reporter for Sports Illustrated, you fought the fight that opened Major League Baseball's locker room doors for all female reporters who followed. So 15 years later, in 1992, I sashayed into those very same doors, covering the World Series as a 24-year-old baseball reporter for Sports Illustrated.
Yeah.
And I didn't think twice when I was handed that credential.
Yep.
Didn't think twice when I was handed that clubhouse access pin. It was my Melissa Ludke given right to enter that locker room, and I didn't expect anything less. I had easy street because of you, so thank you before we get started.
You're very welcome. So I just want to take a moment before she even asks her first question, because my God, that word just leapt out at me. And I carry around with me to these talks a few of the just gems of articles that were written about me in the 70s that give a little sense and a flavor of the time. And when you just use the word sashayed, it brought to mind this piece. So if you don't mind, I'm going to start off by just reading what was written about me by a man who never talked to me, but evidently watched me when I was on an assignment with the Detroit Tigers. And Mark the Bird Fidrich, you may all remember him, yes? Yeah. So I was out in Detroit, sent there on an assignment, and this man named Doug Bradford wrote a piece about me, and it's accompanied by a cartoon in which you see a very buxom woman at a locker where evidently the players have put themselves in the locker and they say, "Go away, please," which was a very strong sentiment at the time about me. So here's what he writes. I'm just going to read a few of the sort of opening paragraphs. And no sachet, okay? So he starts out, he says, I don't know just when it was that I began to fear women in general, and Melissa Ludke in particular. But I think it was the day she sat rather cozily, listen to the words, on the Tiger bench, and she wiggled her little finger at Mark the Bird Fidrich. Well, the bird zipped into the dugout like a homing pigeon. And there just wasn't enough, he could tell Miss Ludke, who cooed one question after another at him. Now this occurred on a day when Fidrich was playing hard to get with the gentlemen of the press, as has been his wont on occasion, ever since he found out that the nation adored him. So now here's we go with the part that I found problematic. The other part I could kind of go with the humor, but here we go. Miss Ludke, who was a top flight writer for Sports Illustrated, also sashayed around some of the other Tigers, asking her pertinent little questions. The answers were woven into a fine story, I'm sure. Now listen carefully. I can only wonder if the highly reputable Melissa accepted any of the various invitations, mostly for drinking and carousing from the Tigers. So evidently the only way that I was capable as a woman covering baseball to get sports was to trade my sexual flirtations and potentially more with these players. And in this story, what it stands out is that it wasn't implied, it was written. In a lot of other stories, it was implied, but not quite written like this. And this is why I bring this one along with me, so you can really get a sense of it. But go ahead.
Well, I do want to get there, because we're so used to the toxicity of social media. And that was mainstream media, that toxicity.
And they had their byline now.
Yeah.
Now it's anonymous.
Right.
So God, there was a degree of civility because they had to have a byline and the columnists had to have their picture at the top. So that made what felt to me like a degrading and demeaning experience so much more civil than what women today have to deal with the anonymity of the social media. But I digress.
Okay. All right, well, let's start at the beginning. So, well, right now, the Yankees and the Dodgers may meet again in the World Series.
Maybe.
So let's go Mets, though. But let's go back a few decades before we get started here. You earned your chops as a baseball reporter for 2 years, getting locker room access to the Yankees at the end of that 1977 season. Then comes the World Series, Game 1, and the doors get slammed again. So what happened?
Yankees didn't slam the doors. What happened is that I had really worked what I would say under the radar. Never going public with my frustrations about not having the kind of access I needed to really do my job. I tried to build kind of detours around the barriers and tried to just do the best I could. But by the middle of the '77 season, my second full season covering baseball, the Yankees, who's the team I knew best at that point, they were a team that had a soap opera inside the clubhouse, and they also had an extraordinary team on the field. They were the team to be watching, and I was based in New York, even though I got sent to places like Detroit and the rest. So I worked with their very young rookie PR person, a guy named Mickey Morabito. It was his first year. Tumultuous season to be a first-year PR person with that team. Reggie Jackson, George Steinbrenner, Billy Martin, Thurman. Oh my God, it was explosive. And so Mickey always found time to be patient with my frustrations. And at the All-Star break, he came back from the All-Star break and he said, you know, I thought about it a lot, and I think I can get you into Billy's office. Would that work? And I said, well, it'd be something, Mickey. Let's try it. You know, I was very much a gradualist because I understood what I was doing. It was a huge barrier, and I sort of got it, that I had to be a leader, but gradually accomplish what I wanted to do. So I said yes. So Mickey went in the front door of the clubhouse. He told me to meet him at the side door. He would go around and open it. He would escort me into Billy Martin's office, and then I would just sit there. And the thing was that I got the story in many ways, because the other reporters would come in and out of the locker room. They'd always be bouncing off of Billy what some player had said. So suddenly I'm privy to things that I had never known before. It's not everything, but it was gradual. Last 2 games of the season, Mickey leaves me a daily clubhouse pass. And I see him on the field before the game. And I said, Mickey, you gave me a clubhouse pass, you know, with you, right? Yeah. He said, sure. He said, I think, you know, you certainly deserve it, and, you know, I know you'll use it well. And by that, I think he meant I can trust you, that you're just not going to, you know, create a situation that I'm going to pay for. Because this was all underneath the commissioner. The commissioner didn't know this was happening. And so, you know, what I have to fill you all in on is I know you think about the locker room. And you think about the chaotic scenes you've seen, for example, after a World Series win, or after a game. And you think about the players are changing and all of that. What you don't think about is before the game. You really don't. I mean, no one does. But you have 50 minutes as a reporter between batting practice and when the game starts. That time is the most useful time that you can have as a reporter on baseball. Because the players are sitting around, signing baseballs, just sitting at their lockers, and guess what? No one changes out of their uniform. There is no such thing as nudity at that time. So you have to ask yourselves collectively here, well, why wouldn't she have been let in? If the problem was nakedness, and there is no nakedness, why wouldn't she be let in? So if you come to the right answer on that, it is that they didn't want women. They wanted to exclude women. They tried to do it by keeping them out of the press boxes. They tried to do it by keeping them off the field during batting practice. They wouldn't let the women reporters eat with the male reporters. They had to have their meals delivered to them separately. Diane Shaw went to Fenway Park. She gets up there, she thinks she's going to eat with her fellow reporters. No, they've set up a picnic table. This is Ladies' Pavilion. She has to sit there alone and eat her meal. So if you think this was about nudity, I'm here to tell you it wasn't. It was about exclusion. So now I'm going to tell you that when Mickey gives me that pass, I only used it before the games because I'm a gradualist. I know that I want them to get acclimated to me, etc. So by the American League Championship Series, I'm using it before the game and then after the game. No one writes a story about it. There is no hullabaloo. She's in the locker room. No one. And so when I get to the World Series, Kelly, you're right. I think I made this work. And so as a courtesy call, I go to the Dodgers because they have no woman covering them. And I explain to them, the player rep, Tommy John, you know, the elbow guy. And Tommy John's the player rep. And so he listens very carefully. I show him my press pass that says I have access to the clubhouse. I tell him about my Yankees experience. He says, he says, I think you probably have a right to be there. But I want to take it back and take a vote of the team. I want them to talk about it. And so they did, and then before the first game starts the next night, that was all during the workout game, he comes to me and he says, it wasn't unanimous. You may face some fury when you get in there, but it's a majority and that's how we work. And so as far as I'm concerned, you can come in. So I say, thank you. I start walking away, he calls me back. And he says, could you tell our PR person, Steve Brenner, what we've just talked about? Again, I'm under no obligation, but I am a get along, go along, mother may I, let's work this right. So I go find Steve Brenner, who I've never met. I have to go hunt him down, and I said to Steve, here's what happened, and he looks just like a ghost. I mean, he's just pale and runs away from me. And he was the one who went and said to the commissioner, we may have a problem. And so in the 5th inning, that's when I'm called up from what's called the auxiliary press box, the overflow. We had our one writer in the main press box, and we had 3 others on our reporting team. We were on the auxiliary. So my name comes over this little scratchy speaker. And the hardest thing for me was getting out of my seat. Now, why would you say that? Why would it be so hard for me to get out of my seat? Okay, you gotta now imagine yourself. You're the only woman sitting in the auxiliary press box. You already know that you're not necessarily the favorite of a lot of these people there. And now you have to squeeze your body past a lot of men who have maybe an excess in their stomach area. And you've got, a plywood board across what are grandstand seats. So you have about 5 inches, where you've got to kind of like this. And every time I walk by one, it's like Jack in the Box. They all have to stand up. So now I'm disturbing all of the men behind them. So this is not a popular thing. So anyway, I finally get to the press box. To answer your question, I met up there and I am informed that it does not matter that the Yankees have given permission. It does not matter that the Dodgers have given permission. It makes no difference that the baseball writers have given me a press pass saying I have access to the clubhouse. There is one man on earth, and I presume potentially someone up in the heavens, who can allow me to do what I've asked to do. And that person on earth, Bowie Kuhn, says, now he doesn't say it to me, but he sends the message that as long as he is commissioner, I will never go into a clubhouse. So that's what greets me at the first game of the World Series, and I might say it's the first World Series that I've actually been on staff at the magazine sent to cover. So I've been elated about an hour before, and now I am just completely deflated and feeling like there's no appeal, because he's the man who holds the authority. So that was it. That was my October 11th, 1977.
So as a result,
Yes.
right, you become a plaintiff in a federal suit
Yes.
against Kuhn. It was the front page news. Sexist backlash was fierce. As you write, this suit was not about women's equity. It was about women's equity, not about men's nudity.
Right.
But to sports writers, political cartoonists, late night comedians, this was all about, as the commissioner put it, sexual privacy.
Yes.
Can you describe how the narrative was set about the case by people like Red Smith, a Pulitzer Prize winning columnist for the New York Times, and our Mr. Sachet,
Well, Doug Bradford, yes.
Yeah.
But Red Smith was much, much more influential for obvious reasons. As you point out, he had won the Pulitzer Prize for sports writing the year before. He was, both by age, by experience, by the fact that he was at the New York Times, sports columnist, and by syndication. He was syndicated throughout America. So for anyone who's too young to remember what syndication was, substitute the word digital media. His columns went over the wire and were picked up by newspapers around the country and in Canada. So what Red Smith wrote, and he wrote it on January 9th, which was less than 2 weeks after the case was filed, essentially, in the business of journalism, we would say it set the narrative. And it gave permission for sports writers around the country to follow his framing of this. And essentially, he framed it as a laughable matter at the end of a serious season, in which he had a number of things that had happened that were serious, but this was a laughable matter. He did refer to me as fluff in the clubhouse. And you will note in my various things that I have here, to see how far that travels, you will see fluff in the locker room in the headline. So it was picked up. His words were picked up. His narrative thread was picked up. And the only saving grace in this story, which speaks to the question that you might have on your, fingertips right now, right at the edge. Why does it matter that women are in sports? Well, it mattered that night because Red Smith was essentially a writer who the word around the newsroom was, you do not change a word that Red Smith writes. You don't change it. Red Smith has written it, it's going out. Well, it just so happened that the editor at the time didn't buy into that. And listen for the pronoun, she, the one and only ever woman sports editor at the Times, Leanne Shriver, did not catch the column before it went out on the syndicate wire. She did catch it for the New York Times. And she did change Red Smith's column to take out some of the more offensive things that he had said. So I just want to read you, see what I carry around with me? I didn't know she was going to ask this. But this is an example of a Red Smith story that got picked up around the country, this one in Columbus, Missouri. And this is how his story ends on the syndicated one that was sent out. And then I'll read you the more boring paragraph that Leanne put in. Had she been thus occupied, meaning that had I just stayed in the group conference for the few players they bring out and not bothered going into the locker room, she would have missed the gathering in another room down the hall where the manager of both teams, and both sides were present to answer all of her questions. She still might have got to see Reggie in the buff. So again, the whole reason that I'm presumed to be there is to want to see the naked players. And so when it ran in the Times, it actually ran with the only headline in the entire country, because I've looked at most of the headlines that ran with that column, that Leanne wrote, "Another view of equality." When you think, what difference does it make that there's a woman in the newsroom there? So anyway, I'll leave it at that. But I mean, she essentially made all the difference in terms of at least shaping it for the actual paper of record. But it went out across the country. It gave sports writers around the country permission to write the kind of stories that started with him. It was laughable, it was comic, and it was time to be open season on describing me as things like fluff in the clubhouse. So that's what it became.
And hurtful.
Well, it was enormously hurtful. Yeah, it was. I mean, the way the men wanted to portray the story, and the way baseball actually portrayed the story, is you have this immoral girl. And if I hadn't been immoral, I wouldn't have asked for this kind of access to go leer at naked men. That was essentially the story that was told throughout that year, really, of the series. And, you know, the headline writers had a great time because there are an enormous number of sexual puns that you can get into headlines and mix them with baseball puns. You know, the girl throws curves, you know, at players in the clubhouse or something. You know, you can just write them all over, trying to stop the damsel at the plate. I mean, you know, you name it. It's all Babes in Boyland, that was another one. So it was all very much along that theme, along that line. And just to tell you, Saturday Night Live, of course, just starting out then, we just celebrated the 50th anniversary. At that time, it was a relatively new show. And let's see if anyone can guess. All right, so they had a host on who was a very famous sports person in 1978. And they did a skit in the locker room, filled with all sorts of sexual puns and innuendos. And the girl reporter was played by Lorraine Newman, one of the comedians on it. Let's see if anyone can remember star athletes from 1978. I mean, big star athletes who would have played the athlete in the locker room.
Can you give us the sport?
A football.
Okay.
O.J. Simpson.
Oh my God.
O.J. Simpson. We'll try one more. So when Johnny Carson did the skit on The Tonight Show, again filled with all sorts of sexual puns, where the woman playing the reporter ends up naked herself before she puts a towel around her torso to get into the shower with him. Now, the shower areas were off limits to every reporter, male or female. So again, but it was, you know, supposed to be a funny skit and supposed to tell America what this was all about. So who do we think played that woman back in 1978? How would I get a hint about that?
She was in a very popular sitcom
Oh, yes. She was in a very popular
with
sitcom.
other women of her age.
Mary Tyler Moore.
Well, it's close, but this woman lived to be almost 100.
Oh, Betty White.
Betty White! So, you know, at least, you know, you can tell. I mean, you know, so they really put their best stars forward on this story. But, you know, so it became part of the culture. That's what I'm trying to get with this kind of little fun quiz, is that it no longer was just a sports story. It became a cultural story, almost what we would call a wedge issue today, if we were talking about it in political terms. So, there I was.
So to go polar opposites, let's talk about the judge who was assigned
yes.
to your case.
Yeah.
Constance Baker Motley, the first Black woman to serve as a federal judge. She's a hero for her civil rights work. Got a recent shout out from Kamala Harris during her acceptance speech. Can you share a bit about how your attorney effectively made the link between race and sex discrimination before Judge Motley?
Well, yes, and my attorney, by the way, and you cannot come up with this cast of characters. I mean, I really could not. You can't come up with it, because my attorney, I knew as Fritz. That's what he told me to call him. But his actual name was Frederick August Otto Schwartz. Short, F-A-O Schwartz. Right? But he was an amazing attorney. He was our outside counsel for Time Inc. And he usually covered, obviously, First Amendment cases, because that's what usually happened at newspapers and magazines. So he was actually thrilled when he got a case that he really wasn't going to be focusing so much on the First Amendment, but more in his strategy, which you want me to get at, is at the 14th Amendment. Because but there were some problems with that strategy, because when you are going up against entities that are privately owned, as baseball is, and as the Yankees are, you cannot apply constitutional protections to a case involving private entities. You have to establish a connection with some kind of state entity. What it's called is an entwinement of state action. And it was developed through something called the state action doctrine. It's kind of interesting, so I'm going to try to simplify it. If this had happened in Dodger Stadium, let's just say if the Mets had been in it, Shea Stadium, we would not have been able to argue this case in federal court in the way that he did. And I'm going to explain why. In 1960, during the Civil Rights era, when my judge was a civil rights attorney with the NAACP working with Thurgood Marshall, there was a case in which a black man went into a restaurant called the Eagle Coffee Shop. That Eagle Coffee Shop happened to be in the lower corner of a public parking garage. It was a case called Burton v. Wilmington Parking Authority. So when I'm sitting in that courtroom as a 26-year-old and I hear my lawyer starting to talk about a parking garage in Delaware, I'm like, what does this have to do with anything that could possibly pertain to the clubhouse? Well, it turns out that if you substitute me for the black man named Burton, and I am trying to get access to the clubhouse in Yankee Stadium that's embedded in a stadium in which New York City put $50 million of taxpayers' money to refurbish it 2 years before, and like the parking authority in Delaware, has a 30-year lease with the Yankees for that stadium, just like the parking authority and Eagle Coffee Shop had a 30-year lease. So, the case with the Eagle Coffee Shop goes through all of the state courts, the appellate courts, etc., in Delaware, eventually lands with the Supreme Court. Every single case of racial discrimination that ends up in the Supreme Court is handled by a co-counsel with the counsel from the original case from the NAACP Legal Education and Defense Fund, Thurgood Marshall, Connie, Baker Motley, etc. Well, who do you think was the co-counsel of Burton v. Wilmington Parking Authority? None other than Constance Baker Motley. So when my attorney, Fritz Schwartz, begins his thing, and we're about 5 minutes into the case, and he says, we are going to base our argument, Judge Motley, on a case that was settled by precedent in the U.S. Supreme Court in 1960. It's called Burton v. Wilmington Parking Garage, and he starts to go on. She interrupts and she says, Mr. Schwartz, continue. I'm quite familiar with that case. I was the counsel on it. So he knew that. I mean, it was a complete setup, and he knew that. So he knew that he was with a judge who knew that argument because she had made the argument. And she had set this precedent, as she did with other cases. She took 10 cases to the Supreme Court and won all of them in the 50s and 60s as a black woman. I mean, it's a phenomenal story. She's a hidden figure in our history. And I get her because they spin a box, and the clerk goes in, pulls out her card. That's how they assign the case. She is the only woman to have ever sat on the Southern District Court of Manhattan in its 189-year history. The only woman. You've heard Kelly say she was the first black woman in the entire federal judiciary, appointed by Lyndon Johnson in 1966. So, and by the way, Southern District Court of Manhattan isn't just any court. It's the mother court of our country, the only one founded before the Supreme Court. It's an incredibly historic court. Here she is, the only woman who's ever served on it. Appointed in 66, 11 years later, she's still the only woman. And she's drawn from my case. So if any of you are going to ask me later, would it have made a difference if there was a man as the judge? Go ahead and ask, and I'll explain why I don't think so. But yeah, she becomes our judge. Now, some things you should know, because this is what Fritz knew. By the time he walks into that hearing, he had done the work you need to do. You know, I'm staring at my friend as a reporter. Anyone who's a reporter knows that a lot of the background you get isn't necessarily going to be written in your story, but it's going to inform your story. So here's what informed Fritz. Constance Baker Motley hated sports. She never played sports in her life. She never watched them. She didn't care about them. Besides hating sports, she hated baseball the most. The reason she hated baseball the most is because her husband, Joel Motley, was a Yankees fan. And when they would get in the car and they would drive to their home, their summer place, their spring place, wherever they went on weekends in Connecticut, which was near her family, he would turn Mel Allen on. She'd have to listen to the games. She hated it. She just wished for those seasons to be over. So Fritz finds this out because he does his reporting. The other thing he finds out is that she is a bit of a prude. So he knows that discussions of nudity are not going to be ones that she welcomes. He doesn't want to engage in those discussions because he's representing me, but he's going to be happy if baseball does. And in fact, baseball does. If you read my book, you'll find out. She just gets exasperated. But he knew these things going in. Why was it important for him to know this? If you are an attorney, you never want to insult the judge in terms of her intelligence. And insulting her about what she might not know about baseball is not a good idea. He was so prepared for that, because at one point, you must have read that, where he's talking about women and baseball, and he's talking about me, and she says, I didn't know that women are playing baseball now. They're on the teams? And he's like, you can see him just kind of pausing, how am I going to get out of this? And so he very gradually kind of walks her back and says, you know, no, Your Honor, I didn't mean to imply that they're players, you know, the baseball is set up this way, and he's very, very careful in terms of how he does it. So anyway, it's kind of an I mean, that's why I focused on this case, because it's very interesting, I think, to see an argument for equal rights argued out in a hearing in a time when the argument is about a case that has exploded into the national attention. And I will grant you, I lost big time in the court of public opinion. The fact that I won in a court of law is, of course, what is endured and what mattered. But there is no question that the arguments used against me, the skits, the cartoons, the stories, the headlines, were very, very much against me. So there was just no question. And I'll end this segment by saying that Judge Motley, later, at dinners that she would attend, legal affairs, often she and Fritz, my attorney, would be sitting on a podium together, or a dais, or at a table, and sometimes she would lean over to him, and he later told me this, which led me to look up what I did. She would say, can you explain to me why it is that I got worse hate mail for my decision in this case than I did for my work in trying to end Jim Crow segregation? She said she just was so puzzled, because again, she had no connection to the notion of the cultural hold that sports has, particularly, you know, from men. And men were reluctant to let women into it. Eventually they've had to, through Title IX and through some of the actions I did and Kelly's presence in it. But she just couldn't understand it. So when Fritz told me that, I looked up the archive and I went to Smith College, where she donated part of her archive, and I found all the letters that were sent to her. They were all kept, along with the replies that were sent out from her office. And they're in my book. I mean, and they're vicious. You read them, right? Yeah. They remind you of some of the social media misogyny of our time. And some of them are anonymous. So.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
A question that I had was, due to like the scrutiny and unjust portrayal that you faced within that time in media, what was kind of your motivation to keep going and your courage to keep fighting for what you thought was right or what was right? And with your book now, what are some other ways that you can kind of inspire other women in, the field of sports journalism to, inspire them to keep growing the field in general?
Great, wonderful questions, and one of the things I love about this book is the opportunity it's giving me to go out to classes literally around the country through the magic of Zoom. And as I say, Kelly invited me to her class, I think last year, and last week I was teaching a class in Kansas. So being able to share these stories with young people and get at some of the answers, and I don't know how well I'll do on this answer, but I'm going to try. So what inspired me to keep going? Doing the research for the book, I was told at one point by Fritz that there were some boxes of all the documents relating to my case that were still at the firm. And when I would go started to go visit them. And they had 5 huge boxes. I mean, there were just more than a few. I mean, it was 5 huge boxes of folder after folder of material. And one of the things I found in those folders was it brought back a memory, but it made it much more concrete. And that is that I found letters that I must have turned over to them that young girls and women wrote to me at that time. And they wrote describing their dreams and what they didn't ever think they could live out. They talked about their love for sports. They talked about how they want to go to sports events or they want to play sports, and a lot of people put them down for wanting to do that and sort of tell them that girls don't do that. There was one girl who corresponded with me, and what I love most about it from my perspective is that I could see in those letters that I wrote back to them, because there were letters that came back about my reply and a correspondence that we had. And in many ways, they did keep me going, because there was one young girl, I think she was 14 or 15, and she shared with me that she had shared a letter that she had written to the Yankees. Sorry about the Yankees again, but here we go. She'd written to the Yankees and saying she wanted to be a bat girl. They didn't have any such thing as a bat girl. They had bat boys. And so they wrote her back and said it's inappropriate for a girl to do this job. Thank you for your interest, but no thanks. And then she told me in this letter about how her mother had suggested that she write to some people in government, and she had. And the New York City mayor's office had written back to her, and they were just in the process of arranging them to come in, she and her friend who had applied, for a meeting, when it turned out that they were going to send her to the Human Rights Commission. And the Human Rights Commission wrote back and said, but we already have a girl who's written to us about this. So we're already working on this kind of case. So there were a number of girls at that time who were begging to play Little League ball because there was no other thing for them to play. They were in court. Maria Pepe in New Jersey, one of the lead cases in New Jersey. Maria Pepe, you may have heard of her. But she was fighting to get in the Little League, but her case took so long that she'd aged out by the time she won her case. But she did enable it for other girls, and they now have tournaments called Maria Pepe. So that sustained me. Whenever I sort of felt like I'm in this by myself, I realized I wasn't, that there were these feelings. And I don't know whether people remember, but there was another woman, Gwen, I'm trying to remember her last name, but let's call her Gwen. Her first name is Gwen. She, last year, was invited by the Yankees. She's now about 70 years old. She, too, had applied to be a bat girl. She, too, was turned down for being a bat girl, and they invited her to come and throw out the first pitch from the mound. Dressed her in a Yankee uniform and the rest, and up she went to at least be given that acknowledgement of her dream when she was young. Can I just say one more thing to answer his question about what would I say to young people today? I would say, don't do as I did. And I'm going to explain that. Don't do as I did. I felt so bombarded by what was coming at me. I really didn't have the maturity. I was 26. I didn't know how to take in what was coming at me. It felt like spikes, coming into me. And I just kind of went insular. And I also made a terrible mistake. A man I started dating a week after the decision was filed asked me to marry him 3 weeks later, and I said yes. And why did I do that? I mean, in the book I write about it as honestly as I can. It was like I was on a sailboat and there was a storm out there, and I was looking for a safe harbor. And being a single, attractive, blonde-haired woman set me up for the kind of things that you see written about it here. But at that time, and you may not believe this now, but think back to the 70s. If you were a married woman, you had there was a very different sense about you, you know? And in fact, I'll prove it, because the day after the decision came down, Mike Ludtke, who still writes sports columns, wrote on the back page of what was then the strike newspaper for the city. They were all on strike. Mike had come to my office right after the decision. We talked, and he wrote a story, and he described in the first paragraph, first of all, he used my married name, which I never used, and it was Lincoln. And he said, Mrs. Lincoln has decided to stay home tonight and cook dinner for her husband. So I wasn't wrong in my analysis of the very treatment. I was wrong to say yes to a man I barely knew after 3 weeks. Okay? And so what that did is it insulated me and isolated me. My friends begged me not to do this, and instead I shut them out. I shut everyone out. And so I say to young people, never make that mistake. If you end up in a situation like Me Too or something where you are the target, you're the bullseye, you have got to find trusted circle of people, and you have got to have them there to give you the support that you need during it. It was a huge mistake, and I warn people against it. So,
Thank you.
that's what I would say. It's all in my book.
I have 2 questions for you.
Yes.
First question would be, where did your interest in sports evolve or come from? And the second question would be, there's sort of a stereotype that's been portrayed of athletes as being less evolved or three-dimensional and kind of narcissistic lugs. As a generalization, could you comment on what you've experienced in terms of the overall mental attitude of the male athletes you've come in contact with?
The players were better to me back then than the sports writers were. It isn't to say that they embraced the idea that a woman should be in their clubhouse. They didn't necessarily, but when push came to shove with the Dodgers, and Tommy John went in and had a meeting. You know, listen, Tommy John was and is today a very strongly devout evangelical Christian. He is someone you wouldn't necessarily believe would think this is a good thing to have happened. And he said to me then, and he said to me now, and he will say again when we do a book event in Sarasota, Florida together on November 14th. He will say again, it makes me very uncomfortable to think about having a woman in the clubhouse, but I believe that you have a right to be there. And essentially, most of the players probably fell down somewhere in that zone. There were always going to be, and I think you'll back me up, a few players on each team who, for whatever reason, they often were utility players, oddly. It wasn't the stars, but they wanted their attention somehow. So they would use crude language, they would make themselves apparently, I don't know, either maybe make themselves naked in front of women, I mean, in order to purposely embarrass them and try to put themselves as the focus. But I didn't have that a lot. I mean, you know, the Yankees clubhouse, one day I did walk in, and there was, when I walked in, there's often, well, anyway, I won't describe it, but there was a little table set out, and there was a cake that had a sign on it that said, for ladies only. And it was baked in the shape of a penis. And so I walked by it, And then I didn't go near it the rest of the time I was in the clubhouse, that I didn't leave the clubhouse. This is their area. I didn't expect they were gonna clean up their language. You know, it's their place, it's their home. I always knew in my head that there was a red line. Didn't you have a red line? Yeah, and if someone crossed it, you'd know they crossed it. They crossed it with Lisa Olson in the New England Patriots locker room when they had to display their manliness to her. So, you know, I mean, I would know that. So that's the first part of the question. The second part was having to do with, remind me.
Your interest in sports.
Oh, okay. Here's this other thing I carry with me. This is so cool. This envelope is the envelope that this letter that I'm about to read you a part of was sent to me when I was 4 days old. My mother gave birth to me as the first of her 5 children in a hospital in Iowa, where she had gone after the GI Bill with her then husband to get her master's degree. My dad got his PhD. And my grandfather from Boston, Massachusetts, where my mother had been his seatmate at Fenway Park, and she grew to love baseball. So this is before you could tune in on streaming media, right? Okay? She's in a hospital bed. She got too much anesthesia in the spinal thing. They forgot to tell her to lie flat. She had a terrible headache. So she's with me out there, and he sends this letter. Now, why do I carry it around? Well, first of all, you have to wonder. I was born on May 27th, and this is dated May 31st. So why did it take him 4 days to write the letter? Well, there's a very easy explanation. On the day I was born, the Yankees were on a train coming to Fenway Park for the first 3-game series of the 1951 season. There was going to be a lot of reason not to sit at your typewriter and write a letter. The Yankees were in town. So my mom dies in 2011, roughly a little while before I start thinking about and researching this book. And I find the whole box with all of the letters and stuff. I open this envelope, pull out this letter here from my grandfather. So he tells me, misspells my name terribly. He says that I've grown a lot since last Sunday in those 4 days, and that I'm going to be a smart girl. So that he gets out of the way. Then in this paragraph here, this is what he writes my mother. And it is from this paragraph that I determined that I was born with the DNA of baseball in me at the moment of birth. So here's what the paragraph he writes his favorite daughter, favorite Fenway seatmate, when she's just given birth. Well, we were thinking of you, and in fact, we've been doing so ever since the event. That's my birth. And yesterday, from 1:30 p.m. and on, we were listening to the Red Sox wang the Yanks. Twice in a row. What a ball game that first one was. 15 innings and some job of relief pitching that Scarborough did. When the Yanks came up with those 7 runs in the 7th inning and made the score 6-10, with 2 innings to go, we thought it was all over. And when Ted Williams hit that home run in the last of the 8th to tie it up, we thought this was the time the Yanks were in for a real battle, and they were. They just couldn't get Ted to hit the ball where they were ganged up on him. And he's been hitting a lot to left for the last 2 weeks, and the Yanks gave up shifting for him, and then he banged them to right and center and all over the place. That's the letter my mother gets at my birth. So if you don't think I was born with the DNA of baseball in me, okay? And so my mother takes me to Fenway Park when I'm 7 years old for my first game. We drive from Western Massachusetts, we go to Fenway Park, I have my little glove with me, and you know, that was it. Last thing I will say is my mother and I didn't get along very well in life, okay? We were just very different people. That happens, but I will tell you that baseball always was the bond. We could always go back to the Red Sox game. We could always talk about baseball. And so I cherish baseball because it gave me the chance to be with my mother in a way that was the way I wanted it to be. And so, yeah, so when I get to SI, what else am I going to want to cover? Baseball. I hope that answers it, but here's the letter I always carry with me.
Hi, my name is Kayla Lombardo. I'm in the sports media space and a product of Title IX as well. I was a college athlete, a scholarship athlete, so I definitely got to reap the work of a lot of women who came before me. So my question is for both of you actually. As somebody in the sports media space over the past 10 years of the start of my career, it has been quite a tumultuous journey, and so I just wonder if you have any advice for young people in sports media trying to navigate a really challenging field.
Kelly, this is right in your target zone, go for it, and then I'll try to see if I have anything.
I would say, Kayla, if it's your passion, do it, right? No matter, I tell my students that want to go into it, it's a tough field to break into. But if you're passionate about it, you'll find your way eventually. So follow that passion. That would be my short advice.
You keep it so short, it's wonderful. It's an admirable
Totally
quality,
fine
and
for you.
I wish I had it. But let me just try to add to that for one sec with a sort of example. I think that young people today need mentors, and even if they have white hair, they can still be good mentors. Quick example. A woman from the Martha's Vineyard Gazette, oldest paper, still running in America, calls me to do an interview before I'm going to do a book event on Martha's Vineyard. So she does terrific questions and stuff, we're through it. She says, all right, I'm drawing a line now, we finished the interview. And she says, you know what, I love hockey. I love hockey. I want to be a hockey writer. And she said, do you have any ideas? I said, well, I've never covered hockey. But we keep talking a little. And it turned out that Helene Elliott, who covered hockey with me in the 70s, just retired from the LA Times after 50 years of covering it. And her husband just died, and she's trying to figure out her life at this point. And so I said to this young woman, I said, you know what, let me contact Helene and see if she might be a person who would like to mentor you, because there's no one who knows hockey better than Helene. And so I put the two of them together by email. And so now they're talking. So you find mentors and you ask around and you find people that can give you a sense of what this experience has been like. Their experience, mine in the 70s is not going to be yours in the 2020s, but there's some things I can offer you. And if I can't just offer you that, I can take you to people, that I've been reading so ask, build a network. And, ask the questions now and get some guidance and some help, support.
Okay.
There's one question behind you, right there.
One last. Could you tell everybody your story about how you used postcards to get your foot in the door?
Oh my God, how do you know that?
I read your book.
Oh. Okay, because oftentimes, to your question that I asked, but I think you're further down the road than this, but when I go to talk with students, they will say that, they'll raise their hand and say, well, what's one piece of advice that you would give? And you know what I say? Get stamps. And they look at me like I am insane, You are so old, and I say, well, when did you last go to your post office box and get a letter, from someone that was written? And a few will sort of raise their hand, but not many, because I don't even think they go to their college, boxes anymore. But I said, if you did, and you found a letter there, and you opened it, and someone had actually put a pen to paper and written you something, would that get your attention more than one of the 150 emails that you get a day? And if you were hiring people and you got a letter from someone that, in a very well-written, concise letter, told you why they care enough to write you this letter and why they're so passionate and what they can bring you to work on this job, would you think that they would pay more attention to that than the algorithmic Indeed keyword search that is going to get them the same looking resumes from about 200 people who have used the same keywords to get the same algorithm to deliver the same resume? When I was hired at Sports Illustrated, you found out I had no credentials, but I had guts and determination and I sent postcards for an entire summer between when I was rejected the first time, and I would send postcards from when I went out and did gophering assignments, for which I got paid $25 a day. And I would be sitting in the 18th hole broadcast booth with Henry Longhurst at the US Open, and I would send a postcard to the guy who rejected me. I'd say, I'm having a great time. I'm in the 18th broadcast booth with Henry Longhurst up here at ABC Sports. I'd go out to Forest Hills. I'd send a postcard from there. Hi, having a great time out here. So when he has to hire someone 4 months later because he's just lost a reporter, okay, just you think about this. On your desk, you've got this wayward resume with a bunch of postcards on it. You don't know how it got really there, and it's still there. And you've got this huge pile, clipped with all sorts of clippings. So every one of them is about this thick with clippings from all of their best stories, you know, in college newspaper. If you are hiring, are you going to spend 7 hours going through all of these different resumes with the clips? Or are you going to pull the one that's in a short file with all the postcards that you remember getting? Well, fortunate for me, he pulled the one. Thank you for the question. With all the postcards, with the stamps. They were a lot cheaper then. And he brought me in for a second interview. And I was hired. I began my magical career at Sports Illustrated as a journalist for 40 years. So I say buy stamps, write letters, and send them to the people who you really, really want to convey how much you want this job and what you can do for them if they'll hire you.
Okay.
I appreciate that question.